Good morning, welcome to the Words of Hope. Today, our topic or our lesson is spiritual growth. The blessing enjoyed in Christ include not only redemption but renewal from baptism, for we rise to walk in the newness of life, according to Romans chapter 6, verse 4. The renewal we find in Christ involves the concept of spiritual growth. Just as a healthy physical life is one of growth, so healthy spiritual life is a process of growth. Sadly, not all Christians grow spiritually. Many have been Christian for years with a little change or improvement. They are no more often less useful to the Lord when they first came as Christian. Failing to grow, becoming as a stagnant pool of water. That is because spiritual growth is a choice. Spiritual growth, like emotional maturity, occurs only when we choose to grow. If we do not make that choice and stick to it, there will be no spiritual growth. To encourage us to make the right decision or choice regarding spiritual choice or spiritual growth, let us consider these things. Number one, spiritual growth is a choice that is commanded by God. This command is implicitly stated in the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 to 20. Jesus commanded his apostles to make disciples, baptize them, and teach them. So Jesus commanded his apostles to teach, baptize, and make the disciple. Implicit in the command to teach is that disciples would be obedient learners, constantly growing as they learn and obey their God. Commanded explicitly in the apostolic epistle in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 18, we are to grow in the grace. We are to grow in the knowledge of God. Peter begins his second epistles in describing how we are to grow in 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 to 8. He said, we must add to our faith such graces as virtue, knowledge, self-control, and more other things. And abounding in this grace, being fruitful, implies growth. Christians who did not grow were sternly rebuked in Hebrews chapter 5, verses 12, and chapter 6, verse 1. Spiritual growth is not an option for a Christian. It is not reserved for a few select Christians. The Word of God commands growth. We should also remember that spiritual growth is a choice that requires diligent effort. This is unlike physical growth. People grow physically by default. No effort is required on our part. We mature physically whether we want it or not. Don't think that just because you grow older, you are growing spiritually. Spiritual growth requires concentrated effort. Jesus said it requires labor in John chapter 6, verse 27. Paul wrote that it requires work and pressing on in Philippians 2, verses 12, chapter 3, verses 13 and 14. Peter wrote that it requires diligence, 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 and verse 10. Like physical health, spiritual growth requires regular exercise, 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7 and 8. Spiritual growth is not easy. We must work at it today, tomorrow, and always. But we can take comfort in knowing that spiritual growth is a choice that is assisted by God. We are not alone in our efforts while we work out our salvation. God is at work in us. Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 to 13. God desires to complete the work He started when He saved us. Philippians chapter 1, verse 6. We are strengthened by God in our efforts. He strengthened us by the Spirit in our inner man. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 16. He empowers us with unimaginable power that is in us. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20. He provides the armor to stand strong in the power of His might. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 to 11. There is no excuse not to grow, for Christ strengthen us. Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. With God as our aid, spiritual growth is possible, and not mediocre growth, but spiritual growth beyond what limits we might think hinder us. And finally, let us remember that spiritual growth is a choice that is blessed by God. The blessings begin in this life. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. As we grow, we experience the blessing of the grace which we stand, such as peace in God, rejoicing in hope, in Romans chapter 5, verse 1 to 2. We must also, in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 18, when we grow, we experience the blessing of adding virtue, knowledge, self-control to our faith, such as a victorious life in which we do not stumble so as to fall, in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 10. Indeed, it is spiritual growth that ensures the abundance of life now that Jesus promised in John chapter 10, verse 10. The blessing continue into the life to come. We will experience an abundant entrance into the everlasting kingdom, 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 11. And in some way, our works do follow us, Revelation chapter 14, verse 13. At the very least, we know that our labors will not be in vain, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58. In conclusion, we have been talking about growth, but not just any growth, for not all growth is good. The heart of some grow dull, in Matthew chapter 13, verse 14. The love of many grow cold, Matthew chapter 24, verse 12. There is a danger of growing weary in doing good, Galatians 6, verses 9, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 13. There is also a possibility of growing corrupt according to deceitful lust, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 22. There is a danger of growing wanton against Christ, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 11. There are those who grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 13. Like the growth of cancerous cells, the wrong growth can be deadly. We have been talking about spiritual growth, and the kind of growth that is commanded by God, requires diligent effort, assisted by God, and blessed by God. It is the kind of growth that Peter enjoined us as he closes epistles in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. What kind of growth is taking place in our spiritual lives? Is it a deadly kind of growth, creating dull hearts, love that is cold, weariness in doing good, even moral corruption? Or it is a vibrant kind of growth in which we are abounding in love, joy, and peace, being faithful and fruitful in our service to Jesus Christ? The one kind of growth is often the result of neglect. The other kind of growth comes only when we make the right choice. If we desire to experience the blessing of the right kind of growth, then never forget that spiritual growth is a choice. Are you making the right choice today and every day? God bless you until the end. May the Lord bless you through this message. Shalom.